And like in the image set, this particular object that we're going to be looking at next is titled a screen. And in the scholarship, it's known as a biombo, even in the English scholarship. And I wish they had used that term, biombo, instead of screen. So they made a couple of changes without my knowing after I stepped off, and I'm not happy. Two of the objects that are on here are not the ones I selected. Apparently the reason is that they weren't able to get copyright permission for these objects, so they substituted these, and I wish they had consulted with me because these are not, they're misrepresentative. And I'm talking about the shell inlay objects. There are two shell inlay objects, the virgin image and the screen, and these are not the objects that I wanted in the show. Shell inlay, although popular for a medium, was not dominant. But so in my presentation today, although this is what we have to work with, I did flesh it out by bringing in other examples of screens to kind of give you a better sense of what these objects really did look like, because the shell inlay screen is not representative of screens as a genre. In any case, when we talk about biombos, which were extremely popular, and as I mentioned several times earlier, when we talk about painting in the domestic space, the biombo becomes the primary vehicle, one of the primary vehicles for non-religious imagery. Okay, some of the terms that can be related to this is like decorative arts, working with the art historical nomenclature, furniture, the word screens, and then the original Japanese word that biombo was derived from, byobu. Biombos is a Hispanicized pronunciation of the Japanese term byobu. And this is the object, of course, that was replaced or put into the image set. There was another screen from the Denver Art Museum that would be very easy to get permission to use. I notified the committee that they should at some point replace this with this other Denver screen, which is a better example of what the screens actually look like. This is rare for screens, the shell inlay. It's not very common. Okay, but in any case, there's a family known as the Gonzalez family whose members were artists. We believe they might have been of Asian descent. They might have been Chinese or Japanese. And various family members not only produced different types of furniture and objects, but a lot of shell inlay work. Okay, so we don't know the exact artist who made this, but it's been kind of estimated, given sort of the type of object, the way it's constructed, that it was probably produced by someone either from the Gonzalez family or maybe an apprentice or student of one of the Gonzalez artists. So the circle of the Gonzalez family. It's the term, the correct term is biombo in the colonial art historical scholarship. This one they tend to be, because they're freestanding, both sides are painted. And in this one side represents the siege of Belgrade. The other side has a hunting scene, kind of like a genre scene. This dates from the late 17th century, 1697, 1701. Bless you. It's described as tempera and resin on wood with shell inlay. There's a word for shell inlay, and that's enconchado. Concha means shell. Enconchado means kind of shelled. So the word, these objects are known as enconchados. Okay, they're enconchado. That's the correct term for this. We need to look at like Japanese prototypes to understand the kinds of screens that were being brought from Japan through the Manila galleon trade, purchased, by consumers, by all the markets, in New Spain for people's homes, and also the kinds of objects artists were looking at. Artists began to emulate these objects and construct colonial versions, American versions. So what really stands out about the byobu, as I mentioned, is that they're freestanding. Okay, that means they can be, and they're usually, the word byobu means wind barrier. So they can be placed in the middle of a room to create privacy, to separate a space. They can be placed before a door or a window. So both sides are decorated. It's not placed against the wall. It's freestanding and both sides are decorated. They're hinged and multi-paneled. They're about this tall. Okay. And in the traditional Japanese byobu, a lot of the representations are garden or landscape scenes, like we see on the left. We also have like urban scenes, as well as narrative illustrations, like episodes of stories, like the Tale of Genji, for instance, is a popular content for screens. So these are the kinds of screens that were arriving from Japan through the Philippines to New Spain and inspiring local artists to produce local variations. But it's important to kind of keep in mind these characteristics of the Japanese originals. Okay, they're freestanding, decorated on both sides, multi-paneled, hinged. And the subjects are landscapes, urban scenes, and narrative illustrations, because these continue. These practices continue in the Americas. For example, here's one that's a bit more characteristic. This is unidentified artist, late 17th century. It represents the Alameda Park and then the Viceregal Palace with the procession in front of it. It's oil on canvas, gold, and wood. Okay. And what's interesting about this is you can see how the artist is what he's emulating from the Japanese prints. If you look at the Japanese screens, I mean, they use gold. So gold is either used as a background kind of element, or in certain narrative scenes, the gold clouds that are placed are meant to direct your eye through the landscape as the story unfolds. There's a function to gold in Japanese screens. And when we look at this colonial variation, it's like, did the artist not understand how the clouds functioned, or is he creating something different? The thing is that he's clearly emulating the use of golden clouds that he must have seen on Japanese screens, but he's creating something different. You know, here the clouds kind of just float in the center of the Biombo, but the way that he positions them, there's like a rhythm as you move across the picture space that almost emulates the movement of the procession. You know, there's a certain kind of visual rhythm that is sort of integrated into our reading of the image. Another question has been the perspective. It's always like this aerial perspective looking down. And that's very similar, again, to the Asian perspective that we see. This appears to be something as well that colonial artists were integrating. This particular view, it's like we're floating and looking down at an angle to kind of get a better view of what's happening. In most of these illustrations, it's like we have X-ray vision. The roofs are missing, so we can see what's happening inside the buildings. And this kind of perspective is like what we see in some of these scenes. You know, we're kind of floating above, looking down, but at an angle. So this appears to be something that might be derived from the Japanese originals. I could say more about this image, but I want to show you a few more. You can see the use of gold that's stamped with floral motifs, again coming from the Japanese originals. The perspective, the urban scene, the clouds, all of these seem to be emulating sort of the Japanese visual language of Byobu. Mm-hmm.
So is the wood just what the structure of it is?
Yeah, in their panels. Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's panels, sometimes it's canvas. Here's another one. This one's at the Franz Mayer Museum in Mexico City. This is an interesting one because this side depicts Mexico City and the other side depicts the conquest. And it's not uncommon to have those two subjects paired, the history scene and the urban scene. And there are legends. There's a key. If you notice, there's writing. Colonial art has writing on it. A lot of it has writing. There's a key that identifies different locations in Mexico City. And many of the locations that are identified in the city are places where important events occurred during the conquest. So the other side depicts the conquest with its own key, identifying each of the different battles, and then the other side is the city. So it makes me think of sort of the indigenous concept of map making, where the landscape elements that are considered important are those places where significant events occurred. So there seems to be some kind of suggestion maybe that there's like an indigenous way of thinking, you know, that is informing these. There's been another suggestion that people living in places like Mexico City were already conditioned for this kind of visual object. And I am referring, if we go back, yeah, to that. There seems to be a suggestion that certain people like displayed screen folds in their homes. But it seems like people might have been conditioned. They were familiar with this type of format. So when we get to the point where these Japanese objects are arriving, it would have like resonated on some level. They're very similar in form. So then we look at this. We see the city. Something that seems odd is that Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, was an island surrounded by lake water. There are actually 5 lakes. And one of the first things the Spanish did after the conquest, besides rebuilding the city using an Italian model, because Italy's the model architecturally speaking, is they filled in the island to connect it to the lakeshore. But throughout the entire colonial period, throughout the 19th century, Mexico City was surrounded by lake. Okay, but it was connected to the lakeshore. And here we see an aqueduct. The Aztec had built the aqueduct. It's salt water in the lake. There was a fresh spring in Chapultepec Hill. So the Aztecs had built an aqueduct to bring potable water into the city, and the Spanish maintained it. They're using the aqueduct to continue to bring water to the city. That's what we see here. It becomes an iconic element that's representative of Mexico City. Here's the Alameda Park that we just saw in the other Biombo, and there's the plaza with the Viceregal Palace. And then the other side has the conquest scenes. What's very interesting about the way the gold is applied here, it almost looks architectural, like arches. And it brings to mind a medieval Spanish architectural element that was introduced by Muslims. In the medieval period, in sort of these landed aristocrats' homes, they're normally placed on hills so they can have views of the land around them. And there would be a window called the mirador. Mirador. Mirar means to look. The mirador is like the looking place. And when the house would be designed, these palaces, there would be a window to frame a view. And it would have this kind of arched element. And they were like strategically placed for these aesthetic reasons, to provide pleasing views of the property around. So when we think about that tradition that we see in medieval Spanish architecture, bless you, that is derived from Muslim architecture, and then we look at that, you can sort of see how these arches are being used to kind of frame each of these conquest scenes. It sort of survives as a viewing element to focus your attention to a particular view. Yeah, each of these vertical panels has a different scene. Yeah. And the key here identifies what you see in each of these panels. These biombos can be read in two ways. They can be read horizontally, panoramically, or they can be read vertically. And the vertical panels usually frame individual scenes.
It almost looks like, but they're all part of the same scene.
Yes, they're all part of the same scene. So the biombos, we never see religious images on biombos. The subjects are always non-religious. We have history scenes, like with the conquest. There's city scenes of Mexico City. We have allegorical scenes, scenes of viceregal processions. We have genre scenes of people like at parties, dancing, hunting scenes. The biombos, because they're placed in people's homes, the subjects are not religious. And they have an interesting function, because besides functioning as furniture and providing privacy or separating space, they also become like conversation pieces. Let me show you a couple of others. Here's a genre scene. This is the one from the Denver Art Museum that AP should be using, in my opinion. And I'm hoping they see this, because it'll be easy to get permission. And this is more representative of the biombo. It's a garden party on the terrace of a country home from around 1725. Again, oil on canvas, gold wood. And it's like a scene of people at a party. These people are playing cards, they're musicians, people are dancing. This gives us an idea of sort of some of the social activities or daily life in viceregal New Spain. We get a lot of information about costuming and like ceramics, material goods. This is more typical of what biombos look like. And here's one that I love. It's one of my favorites by the artist Juan Correa. He's one of the superstars in Mexico City from the late 17th century. And one side, it seems very academic. It's very scholarly. One side depicts the four elements, and the other side depicts the liberal arts. And these are allegorical images. And like the four elements, air, earth, fire, water, they're depicted almost in a classical vocabulary, like nymphs or gods on carriages. Okay, clearly based on a European visual language that is introduced into New Spain. And then you have the texts that are poetic texts identifying the elements. And then on the other side, you have allegorical representations of each of the liberal arts, like rhetoric or history, geometry, along with texts identifying the liberal art. And this is kind of faded, but these little poetic texts, you know, that say something about that particular liberal art. And when you think about this kind of object, typically in a reception room, like a living room, what we would call a living room or a salon where you would receive guests, you can imagine this in there and this kind of inspiring different topics of conversation. You know, maybe something about history or maybe something scientific. There are universities. That's something else that never gets talked about in the colonial periods, that there are universities very early. So there's science and engineering. It's not just religion, art, and culture. You know, there are actually academic pursuits that are explored. You know, so this kind of subject matter, it goes beyond the mere decorative, given its content. there is this interest in intellectual discourse. You know, so these objects would have functioned, in some cases, probably as conversation pieces. Okay, there's an interesting description of one of these biombos, which would have been closer to this one. In a dining room in one of the, I'm talking about the aristocracy who live in these palatial homes. They're just gorgeous, filled with objects from all parts of the world. They'll have like Chippendale furniture next to Italian tapestries, Korean porcelain. Their homes would just be filled with these luxurious objects and paintings and whatnot, rugs. And there's an interesting description of a dining room where there's like a dinner party in one of these palaces, and a biombo that shows a genre scene is in a corner, and there are musicians behind the biombo. So you can't see them. The biombo depicts musicians like this, but the musicians quietly play behind the biombo to entertain the guests. So it's almost like the biombo's alive and performing for you. You know, they might have been used to cover the entrance to the kitchen, you know, but there's this one case where they were used to hide the musicians, you know, as guests were being entertained. You know, so these people, if I ever lived in the past, I'd have to be part of the 1%. Because no matter when you lived, if you're elite, you've got it good. Anything other, forget it. You know, these people who were wealthy and aristocrats had an amazing life. These palatial homes filled with these luxurious objects, the most amazing food, staff and servants. It was not a bad life, you know. And Juan Correa. And so we're back to this. So then we have this. So you can see how it fits within the language of biombos. You know, the freestanding, you know, multi-paneled hinge screen. We have the use of arches here, floral. On one side it's floral. The use of floral decorative element seems to be also inspired by the use of like peonies and other floral elements in Japanese screens. Although it's also been associated with sort of the Rococo aesthetic, you know, in the 18th century. And then we have like a history scene and then a genre scene, a hunting scene. And then what makes this different is that in addition to being partially painted, it also has that shell inlay. And the whole shell inlay thing is really interesting because I've seen some of these in Latin America, and they are stunning works. There's a big screen, I think it was in the Medici collection, that depicts the conquest, where there are hundreds of figures battling. And the artist very strategically uses shell because it's iridescent and it shifts. And it imbues the crowd with movement. It looks like the figures move because they're iridescent. So there are very strategic ways. It's not just slapped on. You know, there are very strategic ways that artists use the shell to enhance sort of movement, to enhance light, especially with religious images. So there's like a logic or intention behind the use of shell that's very carefully done. Okay.